Okay, I'm Arlie Montalvo, the chapter president for Riverside San Bernardino chapter of the California Native Plant Society. And I'd like you to welcome to our December meeting and program. Before we introduce our amazing speaker and program, we have a little bit of business to go over. I just want to let you know that if you're not a member of the California Native Plant Society, this is a great organization of now over 13,000 people. And we do a lot of really amazing conservation work, lots of programs and field trips for people, for the public and our members. Definitely a worthwhile organization to join. You can go on to cnps.org and join. And we also have some pamphlets in the back. I'm just doing introduction stuff before the program, don't worry. Okay, so we have a number of people coming into the room today. It's going to be, I think, a very well-attended presentation. And I just wanted to point out that we did cancel our leftover plant sale that was going to be this morning. And the reason is because we had a very successful plant sale season. The plant sale in Riverside essentially sold out, as did the one in the desert. So there were like 4 plants to bring, and so we'll use those as door prizes as another date.
Plants, the Riverside Coral and Resource Conservation District has their plant sale going at $10, native plant sale going at $10 each back by the gravel parking lot.
Yeah, so that's so you can always come here and get native plants, and then also there are some local nurseries in town that distribute plants from Moosa Creek Nursery, such as the Parkview Nurseries. And so they're becoming more and more available, which is really great. And then I also wanted to bring up an opportunity that the Riverside Corona Resource Conservation District has. If you live within the district, and you'll have to look at the district boundaries on the rcrcd.org website, but they're having you can apply for pollinator kits and get some free plants, all that are really great for pollinators. There's a sun-loving version and a shade-loving version, and we have some handouts in the back of the room that you can look at. You can also go online to their website and see that, but it's a great opportunity to get some really beautiful sages and other plants that are really great for pollinators, and milkweeds and so on. I also wanted to bring up that we have our programs we're getting ready for our 2025 programs. We already have the first 2 lined up. So remember that 3rd Saturday mornings of the month, through the year all the way through June. We kind of go dark on programs during the summer, but all the way through June, we will have a program here at the Resource Conservation District in Riverside at 10 a.m. And the next one coming up is going to be really cool. Chris Koshland is going to be talking about lichens and bryophytes. And bryophytes are mosses and liverworts and hornworts. It's going to be a really cool presentation, an introduction to those groups of organisms. And then in January, the 3rd Saturday of January, we'll have Chris McDonald, who is our invasive species chair. We'll be doing a little weed identification workshop here. So that's going to be an in-person only presentation, I believe, because we'll have a lot of plant material here. Oh, hi. Good to see you. Thank you. And then we're still, Oregon and I are still working on setting up the other months of presentations. We have some things in mind. We just have to see if we can schedule those speakers. And then our native garden tours, we're going to do that again this year. And that's going to be March 29th on Saturday. And I'm going to have Linda Richards tell you a little bit about that really quickly before I introduce the person that's going to introduce our speaker. So Linda.
Yeah, hi everyone. I don't know, can you see this? I'm not sure if
In the
you
back of the room, maybe.
higher. Well, I'm going to pass this around for people in here, but for the on the Zoom anyway. Saturday,
See if you can see it in the picture. Well,
Saturday, March 29th is our second big spring ramble, and we're going to have it in 4 towns, I think, this year. We're looking at Redlands and Yucaipa area in the morning, and then in the afternoon, we'll have the Riverside and Moreno Valley. And so there's a couple things we're looking for. We want to have a few more volunteers this year. One is to just sit at the gardens and kind of help guide people. That would be very helpful. And the second thing is we're always looking for some new gardens. So if you have a yard that you're excited about that has a lot of natives, we're looking for 50% or so, or having a unique aspect to it, like you have a lot of great shade plants and you're plugging in more natives. It can be at different stages. We like to show that. So I'm gonna pass this around, and then I have my contact on here, whether you can see her or not. It's my name, Linda Richards, writer, WRITER @gmail.com. So I'll pass this around, but please email me if you have any ideas of yards or if you can help us volunteer.
yeah. And then we put something on Facebook with not your email address,
Yeah.
but with our.
And we'll have more information about it, but I wanted to get the word out.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great. Okay, so now I'm going to have a friend of the speaker come up front. So Stephen Orr. So Stephen Orr is our membership chair for the our Riverside San Bernardino chapter. And I don't think we've ever had so many new memberships as we've had since Stephen became our membership chair. He really twists arms at the plant sales for people to join. So anyway, here's Steve.
So I'm going to read this if that's okay, because I'm not very good at this. Anyway, my dear friend.
Stand.
I stand over here. Okay.
Yeah. So,
See, I told you I'm not very good at this. Right here, am I in?
yeah.
Okay. So this is my friend Michael, and today I am delighted to introduce anthropologist and author Michael Wilken-Robertson, who will be talking about his research and advocacy work with Native Baja Californians. Michael has spent many years exploring the traditional arts, ethnobotany, history, languages, and cultural landscapes of the indigenous peoples of the northern Baja California region. He has also developed collaborative relationships with Native artists and traditional authorities to foster cultural revitalization and sustainable community development. It's a lot to read. Anyway, Wilken's fascination with native plants and the natural landscapes of the Californias is evident in this beautiful book. How do you say that name, Mike?
Kumeyaay.
Yeah, I always say it wrong. So, Ethnobotany, and his exploration into the many ways that humans have interacted with their environments from the ancient past into the present. After the presentation, Michael will be signing and selling copies of his beautiful book, and along with some Kumeyaay, I said it wrong again, crafts that I am sure he will tell you all about. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, and to everybody that's worked really hard to make it possible for me to be here today. I'm just delighted. I'm always happy to be with my tribe, you know, other plant geeks like me. I actually come to this as an anthropologist who's also interested in people and cultures. But it really started as a kid growing up in the west side of the San Fernando Valley and right next to hills of oak trees and, you know, beautiful native plants. And that was where I spent my childhood growing up and playing and starting to think as I grew up, well, what about the people who lived here before us? And so so that got me interested in the first place in understanding not only the native landscapes that I loved, but also trying to find out about this missing part of it. And I was very lucky that my grandfather was he was from Mexico, he was living in Baja California, and he already was friends with Pai Pai Indians down there. So through him, I had an introduction into the Native communities. And then as a young student at UC Santa Cruz, I was able to do field work in the Pai Pai community. They said, yes, he can come, but he just don't ask a lot of questions. Which I was thinking this morning, that was really a good piece of advice, because it told me just be a good listener. Don't go in and start coming with some preconceived idea about anything. Just go and listen and make friendships. And I'm very happy to say that I'm about the fourth generation of my friendships, the elders that I knew then and their grandchildren and great grandchildren now. So before I go any farther, I realized that I also forgot to say, thanks to Steve Orr, who's worked really hard to coordinate all this and take care of the logistics. And also to my lovely host, Karen. Where is she? There she is, yes. Oh, do I need to be here? Okay. Is it actually being recorded? Yes. Okay, thank you. Yes, my lovely co-host, Karen. Beautiful place, very comfortable. And to Arlie and Orchid and everybody who's been working really hard on all the details of this. So anyway, I'm gonna just get started here with, there we go. Now it's not advancing. Okay, Orchid. She promised to be here and she is, look. How did you do that with this?
This one, and you have a go back also.
Okay, great. So I'd like to dedicate this program to Baja California's Native peoples, past, present, and future, and to all of you who work for the preservation of our natural and cultural heritage. And I feel very fortunate that after I did the work on this, the main research on this as a graduate student at San Diego State, and put it together into a manuscript. I was very fortunate. By then I knew many of the people at the tribes north of the border, and they were very interested in seeing that this work should be published, because they're very aware that a lot of this information is being lost, and this was a way to keep it going, which is also something that most of the informants that I worked, or the consultants that I worked with, were very clear about. They didn't want this knowledge to be lost, and so they were pleased that I was documenting it. So this is a story that starts a long time ago, longer than our lifetimes, longer than 1,000 lifetimes. It's a story that goes back to the beginning of time, when everything was covered by an ocean. Two brother beings lived under the ocean, and after millions of years of thinking and thinking, they began to create the earth, the land, the people, the plants and the animals, the sky, the moon, and the sun. Early on, plants and animals were people too, but slowly they evolved into the way that we know them today. And I think as fellow plant lovers, you might be interested to know that in many of these early stories, like when you hear coyote stories, in many of the cultures that tell these stories, the plants, the animals were people at the beginning of time. And then they slowly evolved into the shape and the form that we know them today. So even trees were like people. They talked, they moved around, but slowly they settled into the form that we know today, which I think is a beautiful idea, because it reminds us of how all of these are living beings like us. For thousands of years, on the western edge of the continent, original peoples and their descendants spent their lives along the coasts, moving in annual cycles through valleys and foothills to the mountains and deserts. And excuse me, in one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. In the course of a year, they could gather seaweed along the beach in the winter, greens in the springtime as they moved through inland valleys and foothills, pine nuts in the mountains in summer, and acorns in the fall as they headed back down to the coast, with countless other plants along the way. The accumulated experience of hundreds of generations of Native Californians interacting with their plants and landscapes, refining and building on that body of knowledge, has sustained Native populations for thousands of years in ways that stand in stark contrast to what has happened to the land and the people in the last 2.5 centuries. In spite of these dramatic changes, today some of the ancient plant knowledge is carried on by the descendants of those who have lived here for so long. We would do well to listen for their wisdom. Ethnobotany is the study of the interactions between people and plants. So there are many different definitions of ethnobotany, but I like that definition, the interaction between people and plants. And I would maybe add to that and how people in different cultures have understood that. So it's an interaction. Well, let me actually ask you this question. Why is it an interaction? Why isn't it just how people use plants? Arlie.
Nurturing.
Okay, nurturing. Okay, the way that we tend the plants, the landscapes. Also, the way plants interact with us, right? So Michael Pollan's written about this a lot. You probably are aware that the way that humans use plants, say if they're gathering something, let's say prickly pear fruits, and they bring those back to where their camp is and they eat them and they throw away the seeds or deposit the seeds with some fertilizer somewhere nearby, that helps that plant get up and move and extend its range, right? So the plants start figuring out how they can use people too. However that works, whatever kind of consciousness that is, and that happens everywhere in the world. It's an interaction, right? And so we're also starting to begin to understand that the plant populations that the Spanish found when they came to the Californias weren't just wilderness. It was something more, in many cases, where people were living, it was more like a tended garden, or at least a tended area. It's not exactly agriculture, I believe, but it's a place where people were interacting with their plants often in ways that cause certain plant populations to reproduce more. And so that's important for us to understand from the very beginning, that when we talk about going back to, say, restore something, what are we talking about? It's restoring at what time in history? And so knowing that history from prehistoric times through Spanish, Mexican, early colonists coming, and of course, Native people living through all that time and responding to the things that were happening in their world. You know, the environment was changing and shifting and also trying to survive. So the people that I've had the great honor to work with and to know as friends are Kumeyaay, Paipai, Kiliwa, and Coat people of Baja California. Kumeyaay territory reaches from the north around Escondido in the United States to Santo Tomas, Mexico, in the south, from the Pacific Ocean to the Colorado Desert. This territory, the Kumeyaay Nation, was bisected by an international border starting only recently in 1848. Before that time, during the Spanish and Mexican periods, the area south of the present-day border, all the way down to the tip of the peninsula, was called Baja or Antigua California, meaning lower or old California. And the area north of the border, all the way up to Northern California, was called Alta or Upper California. Together, they form a continuum known simply as the Californias. In the middle of this continuum, the region along the Pacific coast from Central California well down into Northern Baja California, with a Mediterranean type climate, forms part of, I'm sure you all know this, the California Floristic Province, with many similarities in vegetation throughout the region. In fact, someone was asking me about this yesterday. I think about 95% of the plants in my book grow all the way up here. There, the border really is meaningless in terms of the landscapes that are in this whole region. You recognize all of those, right? Also, along the deserts, we see this kind of a continuum with some interesting changes as we go from north to south. So, for example, in the Mojave Desert, we have the beautiful Joshua trees. And as we go further south, anybody know what kind of takes that niche? Ocotillo, good. Oh, that's why I like talking to plant people. Okay, you recognize all of these? I know some of these toyons are just loaded this year. So thanks to all of these similarities, many of the plants found in Kumeyaay territory are also found in the territories of other native groups of Baja and Alta California, such as the Cahuilla in this area where we are here. And in many cases, their uses may have been very similar. And I just want to mention that I have used I reviewed the ethnobotanies of the Cahuilla when I was writing this, and that's compared also. Some of those uses are compared with what I found down there. And for the most part, they're quite similar. Although there's also, every different ethnobotany adds new richness to our understanding of how Native people have figured out over thousands of years how to use all these plants and then pass that information on. Yes.
Is that Bruce?
Yes. Well, it used to be Ruse. It was just a ruse. It's Melosma. Yeah, Lorena now. So yes. Isn't that a beautiful color? And it turns out that, sometimes the tips are really red. And I've been learning from one of my Kumeyaay consultants that just those red tips, they really like to use to make an eye wash. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about some other uses of it, but they pick those off and they can make a little tea out of it, very mild tea, and then wash their eyes if they have maybe a little conjunctivitis or just need to clean out the eyes. Of course, my disclaimer, all of these things I'll be saying, foods, medicines, everything. You need to know what you're doing, be very careful, know how to use the plant resources in a sustainable way. I'll be talking about those things throughout my talk. And of course, if you're lucky enough to be able to work with elders from the local indigenous people where you live, then you will want to try to learn as much as possible about any of these uses from them. And not just the formula or the recipe, but the whole attitude that goes along with it, the spiritual part. There's a lot to all of this, all the different ways that plants are used. So Kumeyaay territory is located right in the heart of this continuum, partly in Baja California and partly Alta California. And so what we're seeing here is actually Cuchuma Mountain or Tecate Peak with a border fence running right through the middle there. And you might notice that the natural environment has very little interest in whether there's a border there or not. And the wildlife, I'm sorry to tell you, doesn't really carry a passport with them. They just cross over however they can. And so, and that's been going on for thousands of years. So it's important for us to remember when we're looking at, say, maps of tribal territory or California floristic province, that it doesn't really end at the border the way it shows it at the map. This is a bioregion, it's a cultural region, and that border is a very recent phenomenon. Okay, I'll stop harping on about that. Okay. So within Kumeyaay territory, there are many variations in the way people live and speak, including Ipai language in the north and Tipai language in the central and southern areas. These are different variants of the Kumeyaay language. But there are also many things about traditional culture and knowledge that are broadly shared throughout the Kumeyaay nation, including ethnobotanical knowledge and practice. This common culture that transcends the recently imposed international border forms what I'm calling a shared heritage of the Californias. Today, south of the border, many Kumeyaay live in remote ranches where native plants may still be abundant and continue to form an essential part of local economies. So this isn't just sort of a fun little thing they do, once a month for a cultural experience. This is part of daily life, is eating acorns, or in this case, anybody want to guess what that is? Yes. Yucca, that it could be, yes. In this case, it's the bladder pod. Yeah, but they also cook the yucca flowers in the same way. Good guess. Many of the elders I've worked with over the years grew up speaking only their native language, walking barefoot, getting their water from a creek, and living in homes made from local plants. Some of their grandparents remembered stories of missionaries, soldiers, and marauding Colorado River Indian tribes. They've also been extremely poor and faced countless hardships, but at the same time, their native culture and knowledge of the land is often the very thing that made it possible for them to survive all these changes in their world. Many of the plant specialists I've worked with never had a formal education, but their vast knowledge of plants and every part of the environment never ceases to amaze me. And I like to have this photo here because it reminds me of Doña Teresa that I've worked with since 1980 when I first went. And when I first talked to her and introduced myself, I said, well, I'd like to learn from you. And I just come to listen. And she said, well, I don't know anything. And I didn't know what she meant. Later, I realized, as I got to know her better, she felt inhibited because she'd never finished even elementary school. And yet here's a person that knows probably a lot more than many biologists that work in this area about the native plants and native animals. And so I came to realize that in her own way, she has her own PhD. Also, she speaks 2 indigenous languages as well as Spanish. So I just have this great reverence for the knowledge of people like Teresa Castro and feel so privileged to have gotten to work with her. Although many have now passed on, fortunately, new generations of elders and recently more and more younger people have become interested in learning and transmitting plant knowledge. One of the great joys of my life has been the enduring friendships with many of the elders that I've had the opportunity to work with over the last 45 years. People like Teodora Cuero of La Huerta, who passed away in her mid-90s only a few years ago. Teodora was a dear friend, a teacher, and a kindred spirit whose joyful and dignified sense of being and profound affection for the land of her ancestors has been an inspiration for many. I also want to thank Deborah Small, my dear friend, who took many of the photographs that like this that are just amazing photos. Deborah took those and generously shared those with me for the book. John Mesa, a traditional singer, and as he described himself, a binational Indian, spent many of his final years mentoring and passing on his knowledge of songs, plants, and other aspects of traditional culture to his students. Celia Silva of San Jose de la Zorra, whose wonderful sense of humor and vast knowledge of plants made visits with her an absolute delight. Fortunately, some elders like Teresa Castro continued to share their skills and wisdom in their own communities and at reservations, parks, universities, and other sites in the US and Mexico. A younger generation of up-and-coming elders also continues to keep ethnobotanical knowledge and practice alive through teaching and the ongoing use of native plant foods and medicines, tools, construction materials, and ceremony. As here, Norma Mesa is about to do some smudging of the white sage as part of a special ceremonial activity that we're doing. Many of this generation are also fluent speakers of their native language and participate in teaching and research. So let's talk a little about the languages. Kumeyaay, Paipai, and Coatl languages spoken in this area are closely related to other native languages of Baja California and Arizona, belonging to a larger family of languages known as the Yuman languages. Once the dominant languages spoken in the region, these languages are now spoken fluently by only a small number of native speakers, many of them living in Baja California. And people often ask me, well, how many do you mean when you say small? With Kumeyaay, there's probably, it depends how you define speaker, but fluent speakers, there's probably about 45 to 50 Kumeyaay speakers in Baja California, and probably less than 10, if that many, in California. Paipai, there are probably about 50 speakers of fluent speakers of Paipai. Now their language is closely related, as you can see by the color coding here, to the Yavapai, Wallapai, and Havasupai peoples of Arizona. And so there's a whole interesting story about some of the oral tradition from those groups about the Paipai who left at some ancient time and went to Mexico. And during the time I've been working with them, there's been times that we've been able to bring them all together, and that's been super interesting too. So the Yuman languages in their broad extension from the Pacific coast to the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River remind us of thousands of years of history in this region. Relationships between these languages reflect these ancient cultural connections. During my fieldwork, I had the opportunity to collaborate with many of the native speakers to document plants and their uses in both Kumeyaay language and in Spanish. That was thanks to a National Science Foundation grant and called Documenting Endangered Languages. And they just needed to hear the language being spoken in conversation. And I was just about to start all my research on the ethnobotany. And so when the linguist came to me and said, we need you to do the field recordings. And I said, well, do you have word lists or how am I going to do this? No, whatever you want to record, just people having conversations. Really? Like about plants? And so this was just like one of those amazing things for me to get to go out with people like Teodora and her family members that speak Kumeyaay, and just walk around talking about plants, them having conversations between themselves and recording that in Kumeyaay, and then immediately re-recording it in Spanish. And then from there, I recorded it in English, or I translated it to English. So the spirit was with us somehow, making all of that possible. Those recordings are also in the archives of ILI, which is the archives of indigenous languages of the Americas, which I think is it's in Texas. I think it's Austin. So in many cases, the names of the plants are similar or the same throughout the region and can help us reconstruct ancient relationships between native groups. So just a little bit about language. You can see here, oops, I need to stay over here, right? Okay. You can see in what's written over there that the language, the ways that it's been recorded, the name of each one of these plants seems to be very different from place to place. But for the most part, the basic root of this word for white sage, just as an example, is tai. Tai. Can you say that? Tai. So that is a phoneme. And in fact, a phoneme is a unit of sound. It's a part of sound that has a meaning that makes a difference in the language. So that sound is hard for us to write because we don't have a letter for it, right, in our orthography. And so different people have tried to write it in different ways, whether that's an LHT for die or an SH die, and it can vary a little bit. Or whether you write a Spanish researcher or a Spanish-speaking researcher or an English researcher, you might use the J or you might use the H, which are similar, I mean, which have different meanings in both languages. Anyway, so that's led to confusion, but basically there's kind of a root sound for each one of the words for the names of these plants. And so in my book, I give you the different ways that it's been recorded in different communities. And that's in part because, as we were seeing here yesterday, as Aaron and Jen took us around and showed us what they're doing here, and interested in doing some kind of informational signage, at least for different plants, maybe their name in Kumeyaay or whatever language they're going to decide on, and then English and maybe Spanish. You have to figure out what kind of orthography, what spelling you're going to use to write that. Luckily today we have QR codes, so there's possibility of actually looking at the plant, clicking with your phone and hearing a speaker say the name of the plant. Wouldn't that be cool? Or even a little video of the speakers talking about how they use the plant. Sometimes technology is great. Supai, yes. So Paipai is closely related, and Paipai is the next group south of the Kumeyaay. Paipai language is related to what we call the upland Pai languages, which are those of Arizona. And that means Supai in the Grand Canyon. Have you been there? Yeah, beautiful place. And that's closely related to Wallapai, like along Peach Springs is where they have their reservation, and some other settlements around there. And the Yavapai, who are all the way down into central southern Arizona, all the way over to from Prescott down to Scottsdale, large, huge part of Arizona. And they all, in these different times that we've been able to bring them together, they've all compared their languages, and there's a lot of similarity. So that separation with the Paipai probably didn't happen too long ago, maybe 300 to 500 years ago. So the archaeological record of the region tells the story of how ancient peoples created stone tools like metates to process seeds like bitter acorns and holly leaf cherry stones and transform them into nutritious foods. Some Kumeyaay continue to carry on these traditions today. Fragments of cordage, nets, and sandals found in archaeological sites have been dated to over 9,000 years old and are reminders of the ancient origins of traditions carried on today by a few native artisans like Teresa Castro, a Coatl and Paipai speaker of Santa Catarina. And I just want to mention that about the dating on that. My colleague, Matt Delorier, who teaches at Cal State at CSUN, Northridge, He's been carrying out archaeological work for many, many years down at Isla Cedros, about halfway down the peninsula. And he found some pieces of this kind of cordage, maybe part of a net, that was in perfect place for preservation. Maybe it was a dry cave or somewhere they found some pieces of it. And it was, he had heard from me about how they were making the fiber cordage in Santa Catarina. So he knew the technique and everything. And he was astounded to see it was the same sort of, they call it a Z twist, how they do the twist, but it was 9,000 years old. So, you know, string is one of the first things you need as a hunting, gathering, fishing person, for nets, for carrying stuff, for tying stuff up. And agaves have lasting power. Believe me, I'm trying to compost them now, and it's not easy. Hopefully without the darn weevils. Okay, so prehistoric basketry, occasionally found in archaeological sites, also reminds us that native peoples throughout the Southern California and Baja California region have long been producing baskets made from local plant materials for processing and storage of plant foods. Split juncus coil basketry, strong, useful, and durable, is also part of the shared cultural heritage of the Californias. So I'm going to just very quickly pass these around so you can hold. Oops. Whoops. Let's not have an earthquake. There you go. So these are some examples of this amazing basketry that some of the Kumeyaay women make that is so functional. Originally, it was made as a utilitarian type of a basket, but today it's one of the most important sources of income for the ladies. They work for months on a basket like this, and then they're usually able to sell those to collectors, and have some income doing something that's part of their culture, and that all the inputs that they need for that come from their environment. So the black, yeah. Okay, repeat. Oh, the question, yes. Oh, good. So the question is, how do they make the dyes? So the juncus has a natural brownish, reddish brown color that you see here. That is at the juncus textilis, which is the basket bush or basket weavers. Basket brush juncus. It has that color down toward the base of, now, okay, this is where I need your help. Is the thing on the juncus a leaf or a stem? Thank you. Okay, the stems, Arlie, yes, I've been wondering for years. So the stems of the juncus, there must be a leaf hidden on there somewhere. Okay. Anyway, at the base is that beautiful brown color, but the black, each woman has her own different recipe. And I sometimes call it a witch's brew because it's this dark, dank thing that smells horrible. And they leave the juncus in there for about a month, and they pull it up once in a while, look at it. And then when it's finally really finished, they'll pull it out and use it. Now, that can include things like soot from their wood burning stove. It can include rusty nails. Some of them use white sage. Some of them use elderberry. And trying to think if there's any. Each lady has their own special recipe. So then it's very light fast. I've noticed that if I have these in some of the museum exhibits that I've done, that I've curated, if they're under too intense a light, the reddish brown part will fade more quickly. The black just stays. It's very light fast. Of course, now we're using lights that don't affect basketry as much, we hope. So in Baja California, I'm sorry, today's basket makers create an astounding variety of beautifully crafted designs and shapes using the same basic techniques passed on from their grandmothers. In Baja California, these baskets are made primarily in the Kumeyaay community of San Jose de la Zorra, using two types of native juncus found in creeks and wetlands of the region. So we can see here, okay, which juncus is this? Juncus acutus, good. Also known as the common name, Juncus acutus, spiny rush, I think it is. And this is the Juncus textilis, which is the one that they use for wrapping around and around and around. So each time, let me go back here. Each time that they have to make a little hole in the body of the basket, they have to take that Juncus textilis strand, wrap it around, pull it through, pull it tight. And they tell me that in order to make sure that it's not going to break when you pull it like that, that you need to collect the material at the time of the full moon. So for them, that's very important. That gives it more strength. And I've asked them in different ways, well, why do you think that is? And they're just like, we've done it over and over, you know, we don't need any scientific proof. It's just, we know that when it breaks, and then someone will say, oh yeah, I gathered that at the wrong time. So traditional Kumeyaay techniques for management of the Juncus harvest may provide useful guidelines for sustainable harvesting of this important basketry material. So since you're into the details here, I'll tell you that the way that this woman is gathering the Juncus textilis, she just pulls a stem up one at a time, and she doesn't take them all. And she says when she comes back, there will be, you know, in the next year, there will be more of the kinds of stems they want. Now with the Juncus acutus, they coppice it, and it sort of mimics what happens if an animal comes along and eats it, or if it's in a creek and a flood comes by. And so that also leads to nice, long, clean strands coming up in the next season. So they're living there, their ancestors lived there, they are noticing these things. And that's why their management techniques aren't just woo-woo stuff. They're based on noticing what's happening and interacting with those plants. Willow baskets made through an ingenious coil technique using branches and leaves of the native willow tree may be used to safely store the fall acorn harvest. I'm going to escape from my podium once again. Okay, I want you to see this and smell it, please. Weavers create a strong wall that allows air in to help acorns stay dry while keeping bags and other critters, keeping bugs and other critters out. If you've worked with or looked at acorns, you'll notice often they have a little hole in them. And that's the worm that affects them. So they have to throw those away. They don't collect those. There's a lot to just the collecting of and storage of the acorns. So we can see here this ingenious coil technique that they use to create the wall of that. And I think one of the most important things is you can store things over time and they don't get moldy like they would in a plastic bag, because this has some air coming through. And some people say there's even something in the willow leaves that helps keep the bugs out. Which, you know, willow leaves do have, what do they have in them? Yeah, salicylic acid, or what we know of as aspirin. The development of pottery over the last 1,000 years also provided Native Californians with more options for processing and storing plant materials. The dried stalks of, the dried stalks of this Mojave yucca proved to be an ideal material for firing pottery. Cooking, toasting, soaking, storage, and other uses of pottery have allowed the Kumeyaay to use their plant resources more intensively and in an ever wider number of ways. And you might be interested to know that that big pot on the far right, which is obviously a storage vessel, as it says here, is full of dried islay fruit. Anybody know what islay is? Islay? It's actually, this is the holly leaf. Yeah, holly leaf cherry. We call it islaya in Spanish. And in Santa Barbara, if you've ever driven around there, there's Islay Street. I was very happy to see that. So that's our holly leaf cherry, which I think was a much more important resource source than we know. We tend to think of acorns as being the staple for Native Californians. Well, it was very important, but there was a huge diversity of different foods available and that they took advantage of and needed to know, because not every year is there going to be a great acorn harvest. Yeah, that's right. The coyotes love those holly leaf cherry seeds. The arrival of the Spanish in the region, beginning in 1540 and starting permanent colonization in about 1769, drastically affected the Kumeyaay and their relationships with the different environments that they moved through. The introduction of foreign diseases, livestock ranching, and agriculture would forever change the Kumeyaay way of life. No longer able to freely move throughout their traditional territories, many of them eventually took up a more sedentary way of life. The Kumeyaay found ways to transform their world while maintaining traditional knowledge that helped them survive. The shared heritage of plant knowledge has continued to provide food, medicine, tools, construction materials, and ceremonial items. Okay, quick pop quiz. What's this on the left? Great medicine. Elderberry, good. That's your second one today. Okay, so if you know how to gather it, you can gather elderberry, dry it, and not go to Whole Foods and pay $20 for a little tiny bit of elderberry cough syrup, right? It's great for things like when you have congestion or you need to cut a fever, something like that. And what about the one on the right? Ephedra. That's our ephedra, also known as Indian tea. Today, their lands in Baja California have been reduced to a fraction of their original territories. These are located in 4 federally recognized communities. Although these communities usually have a central village, many people still travel seasonally to remote ranches or outposts. Fortunately, these communities are located in different ecosystems. So between all of them, there still exists an extensive knowledge of a variety of plants and ecosystems. So I'm showing you some of these different communities. Now you might say, well, where's the community? Well, for the most part, they don't really live in one village. They live spread out, as they have for thousands of years. And they go to an area, kind of spread out and stay in that area. Now live there, but in the past they might stay there for a while until they move to the next place. So I want to just go through a few plants. I know, as usual, I've been a little too talkative here. So let's see, we're at 10:53. We're okay?
As long as you want to talk, everyone will hang out.
You're my kind of people. Okay, you might be sorry. Okay. So I just want to go through some of these plants. I'm sure, let's see. I'm sure you all know California buckwheat. And I noticed when I started looking through the literature on this, that some people talked about eating the buckwheat. And what I found working with consultants was nobody ate it. It was used as a medicine. And the main use that I found was as for any kind of a digestive upset, like for diarrhea or bloating, anything like that. It kind of it helps, just helps you feel better when you're having those kinds of problems. And then I came to find that, the seeds in this are so tiny, there's really not much of anything to eat there. What tends to happen is some people will go and ask, oh, how did you eat this buckwheat? Did you make pancakes? And people will say, well, yeah, because they don't want to say no. People tend to usually, if you've done, any kind of interviewing, people will respond how they think you want them to respond. And so this is a problem in ethnobotany too. People will go in with a preconceived idea that because it's buckwheat for us as a food, that they assume this is a food. So I'm saying all that to just say, don't pay any attention. I'm sorry, but I don't think people were eating this. You know who does eat it? Ants. Have you ever noticed how the chaff from this you'll find around the ant holes? So a friend of mine and I have the theory that the ants, it's a nice big chunk of food when you're ant size, right? And so they're probably taking them down into the hole, or maybe even before they take them down, they process them, but they end up around the ant hole at a certain time of year. And then they can probably get something out of that little seed. Now, Eriogonum is part of a much larger family that includes an Asian variant, which is the food buckwheat. So it's not completely, out of range to think that there is a buckwheat an Eriogonum that is a food. So as far as how people used it, generally, people like Teodora here would gather it when it was a newish flower, and they could use the flowers, the seeds, the leaves, and even the roots. Some of my consultants said, oh, you just use the root that's going toward the north. You don't use just any root, which if you think about it, that's a way of teaching people to gather in a way that doesn't destroy the plant, right? I mean, that's my Western scientific way of understanding that. There may be other reasons that they're doing that. Anyway, and then you make a tea. And I did this when I was writing my thesis on ethnobotany. I had, for about 3 days, I hadn't been feeling well. And so when I came to gathering all my materials together for this and started writing about it, I thought, well, you hypocrite, you've got this growing right out in your yard. Why don't you gather it and try it? And I did. And within about 20 minutes, I was better. I mean, it really worked for me. My symptoms were, I just was feeling bloated and sort of like when your stomach is unsettled. Yeah. And maybe some other things that are a little too much information. But it cured all of the above. So,
Does the type of Eriogonum matter? Like giganteum has a really big leaf.
oh, yes. Thank you. Don't hesitate to remind me. Yes. So does the type of Eriogonum matter? And boy, there is so much variation in Eriogonum. It's an amazing plant. Yeah. And family or genus, let's say. Yes, it does. And I think this standard Eriogonum fasciculatum is the one that grows all over the place. That's the one that people told me about. They never took me over to show me one of, well, actually a lot of those, like the ones in the Channel Islands, don't grow in their territory. So, one of the things that people who use plants will tell me is try a little bit, just a very diluted solution. And if that feels okay, then you can try a little more. And I'd kind of be curious to know better whether it's in different species of that genus. So the jojoba, now here's another funny one that people assume because it's sometimes called goat nut, and it's this beautiful seed that you can crunch down on, and it feels nice and oily and like it would have a lot of food value. Well, it turns out it's not really an oil, it's a wax, and it's indigestible. And so in my book, as I started doing research on jojoba, I found so much interesting information about it from the Spanish missionaries who were fascinated with it. And some of the first Spanish who came exploring through Baja California, they left from the missions, and from there they had olive oil because the missions had planted olives early on. But their olive oil ran out, and so they started trying to make oil out of this. And it didn't work very well because it's undigestible. And one of the Spanish said, and so we tried to cook our fish with the jojoba oil, and lo, and yay, just as it went into our bodies, so it came out. And the soldiers were not pleased to find that their clothes were soiled. So, so anyway, so don't use it for oil. I have actually toasted it and tried to make something like in my coffee maker, make a little chocolatey coffee tasting thing. It was pretty good. It does have a lot of that kind of wax in it. My disclaimer again, I'm not telling you to run out and do this, but I'm just telling you about some of the crazy things that I do. So the pinyon, and we have, you know, these two main kinds in Baja California, is also a really important source of food for people in Baja California. I'm assuming the Kumeyaay, does anybody know that? We're using pinyon quite a bit, yeah. And so generally all over the world, hunting, gathering peoples, we're looking for foods with a lot of oils or fats in them, because those are the ones that give you the most sustained energy over a longer period of time and the most bang for your buck. You know, if you want to look at a hunter-gatherer economy, you're talking about how much energy do you expend to get calories back, right? That's an economic system. And so it turns out that in that economic system, often when you look at averages over a year, people are working way less than we do, even though we always say, oh, it must have been so much work to grind all those acorns. But actually, a lot of the studies on this are showing that for the most part, people were able to get the calories that they needed, as well as, you know, things like tools or construction materials, but they were able to get everything they needed to survive in quite a few less hours than we work in our work week with all our time-saving devices today. And so there's also a process to preparing the pine nuts, although they can just be eaten out of the shell too. How many of you have ever eaten pine nuts? Okay. As well, I mean, of course, pignolias and pine nuts from other parts of the world, but we have our own native pine nuts. They're important all through Mexico, through obviously Navajo peoples and other peoples of the Southwest use pine nuts. A plant that I feel is overlooked a lot is chamise, because it's just there. It's always there everywhere in our chaparral, right? But it's such an important plant. For Native people, it was especially important as firewood. And so people were able to, and you'd think, well, it's all branches, you know, thin branches. Well, it actually has a burl. And that picture I showed at the beginning of a man carrying firewood, that was this same chamise. And it turns out that it burns really well, and people like it because they can put it in their wood burning stove at night, and in the morning it's still got coals going. So I think often in ethnobotany, we overlook certain things like how is wood used for something like firewood, because we don't like the idea of just burning up wood, but it is definitely a part of what people were using in their daily lives. And so we need to look at that impact too. And were there ways that they could do this that didn't cause the population to go extinct? Well, obviously the chamise population is not on the verge of going extinct. So I think it was probably used in a fairly sustainable way over thousands of years. One of the things Teodora told me when I asked her about how people would gather it, she said, we mostly went out and gathered what was already dried and dead because, you know, that was easier. So that alone is kind of a management strategy. Now, I mentioned the desert agave. We have both the coastal agave, the Shaw's agave in Baja California. And then the main desert agave here, there's a variety called Pringley, which is this more greenish one. You see how different it is from the blue, the nice bluish kind of deserty blue, gray, silvery color. And that one grows right around where the Pai Pai live, and in this area where people are still making a lot of cordage. And so I'm kind of intrigued. Somebody needs to do a study on this. Is there some relationship between people using the plants and where the extension of that plant is? I'm not sure how you'd figure that out, but it does have nice long leaves that give you nice long fibers for making cordage. And of course, it wasn't just used for cordage, but also a really important source of food. And I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but the archaeological literature of Southern California, Northern Baja, is just riddled with reports of agave roasting pits throughout the desert areas. And these are pretty easy to detect. And I've gotten to go through an agave roast with people in Baja, and you all are really lucky because you have the Malki Museum not far away. You could go and participate in an agave roast one of these days. And it's wonderful that local Kumeyaay people open that up to everyone that wants to participate, and just see how it's actually done. Because according to the historical reports, when the Spanish arrived, there were, that was the daily bread of the Indians, they said. This little patties that were made out of the agave after it was cooked. So that cooked agave, I'm gonna go back that slide. That cooked agave also is full of fiber. So people would eat it and then spit out the fiber. And guess what? If you were doing that 3,000 years ago with your buddy and you were, talking about, your deer hunting yesterday, all those, if they're in the right situation, that fiber could last. And not only could it last for 3,000 years, it could also be dated. And so it's those, they're called quids. That's what you spit, the fiber you spit out. The archaeologists have a name for it. And those quids can be dated because they're organic material. Isn't that cool? So you learned a new word today, quids. Like coprolite, there's a great word. We won't go into that one. Okay, so we all know, we all love chaparral yucca, right? Just beautiful this in the springtime. Well, it turns out there are many different ways it can be used. When the stalk is first coming up and it's kind of bulging at the base, they'll cut the whole thing off and roast it like they would agave. And that's edible. Or you can cut the base off when it's a little higher and it's more tender, and you can it's more like sugar cane. You let it grow more and you roast, and you cut that off and roast it, and it's more like potatoes. So that, and then you can also take the flowers and as you mentioned, I think earlier, and make it into like a stew. You have to throw the water off a few times because it's full of bitterness, which is probably something that the plant has to keep people or bugs from eating it. So, but that also makes you wonder, well, if people were cutting this off right at its point of reproduction, then how did they reproduce? How did they not wipe out the population? And that's a really good question. And one of the things that I found is that there are what we call cultural prescriptions. There are rules, instructions about which ones you can take and which ones you can't. And different groups have different ideas about it. Well, if they're all growing together like a family, you're not going to bother the family. You're going to maybe take one that's out here, or the opposite. You never know. But there was kind of rules where you don't just take them all out. And also, like with the agave, if you're cutting them off right when they're about to reproduce, if you've worked with agave at all, they're putting little pups out, right? Little clones. And so these plants, often in response to this coevolution with humans, are coming up with ways that they can survive. like cloning. And those plants are going to survive better than the ones that don't know how to do that. So we see with agaves that almost all agaves are really good at cloning. And that probably tells us a little something about this coevolution with humans. Now, I love the holly leaf cherry because, well, there's just so many things about them, because you can eat the fruit just as is when it's really ripe. Or what people really wanted was the seeds. So you have to well, first you gather the fruit and you can eat that, but you can also take the seeds, let them dry, crack them open, and then grind them up. And here she's winnowing. The baskets are used as a way of sifting, separating larger and smaller grains, and then they'll regrind the smaller grains. And then once they're all ground up very fine, they'll leach it, because they have to leach. What are they leaching out? What is the thing that's in there? Cyanide. Good. So that's one little detail that would be good to know if you want to prepare this. And in fact, Norma here, when she was making this, she leached it about 3 times. And then after that, she started tasting it and she'd say, no, it's still a little too spicy. Which was the cyanide. Now, it turns out that cyanide is, in very small amounts, is probably not so bad for us. In fact, my mom, when I was a kid, she said, eat those seeds from the apples because they have something in them that's good for you. Now, I don't think she was trying to get rid of me. I wasn't that much of a brat. But, cyanide is, or that, whatever that substance is what was used in Laetrile, which was used as sort of an alternative cancer treatment. It's in all those hard stone fruits like apricots, almonds, things like that. But humans have selected for over 1,000 years of domestication, selected for the ones that don't have that in them. So the almonds that we know today are probably pretty much cyanide free, I hope, because I ate a lot of them. And this is the pudding that comes out at the end of the porridge. It's actually quite delicious. It has a nice kind of an almondy flavor to it.
Do they sweeten it?
So do they sweeten it? The question. Actually, you can, and you might put some honey or sugar in it. But both the acorn mush and this one were often eaten with meat. So we might think of them more like mashed potatoes with meat or something. And I mention that because I see recipes all the time for, acorn porridge with lots of sugar in it. And I think or acorn cookies or whatever, which is fine, except that it's not really the way people were originally eating it. And the acorn mush is a little more different for our Western palate. But I've gotten to really like it, depending who prepares it. Oh yeah, so this is the manzanitas, and there are certain kinds of manzanitas that are best for eating. The big glauca, Arctostaphylos glauca, is not so good. What do we call that? Big berry, yeah. But I'm not sure which one this is. That's why in my book it says Arctostaphylos species. I'm sorry. There were a few types that people were gathering, but I wasn't able to get a clear identification. And I guess manzanitas they don't like to reveal themselves to just anyone. Anyway, you kind of crush them up and remove the hard seeds and make what's called manzanita cider. The prickly pears are super interesting too. These are from Ficus indica, so more of no, I guess, I'm not sure. But anyway, the one on the bottom right is one of our wild prickly pears. By the time the Spanish got to the Americas, the ancient peoples had already hybridized the opuntias in many different ways, the prickly pears. And then, they took some back to Spain, continued playing with them. And so the Ficus indica that we have today is a result of that. It's been, a lot of spines are removed. It has more different types of, like there's an orange one, a red one, and what they call a white one. different flavors. Turns out in southern Mexico, there's even a prickly pear that's made for stews. It's made for savory. It's not meant for sweet eating. People will take these and cut them open and eat them, eat the flesh, but they'll also dry them. And that's important for Native people to be able to dry stuff. So you don't just, when you don't have a refrigerator, you have to have a way of keeping stuff. The seeds could actually be ground and eaten if needed, but not a favorite food, but definitely something edible. And the pads, of course, yeah.
Does when the cochineal that accumulates on the pads of any of these, are they ever eaten or only used for dye?
So the cochineal, you all know that it looks like a white sort of fungus or something. And that's a little bug that lives on the prickly pear. And it has a beautiful burgundy kind of red color. If you crush a little between your fingers. I first got to know it in the 80s when I was going down to Oaxaca to buy woolen blankets that were being made down there, and they used it as a natural dye. And it turns out that with different things you add to it, mordants, I guess they're called, yeah, the alum and things like that, you can get a whole range of colors from a beautiful salmon to a deep purple. And so this turns out it was one of the main exports from Mexico, I think number 3 after like gold and I forget what else, yeah, to Spain, were what they called granillo, the dried cochineal, which was being sent back to Spain. They didn't have aniline dyes yet. And so they needed natural sources of dyes, and they were crazy for this royal kind of burgundy and purple colors. And so that turned out to be a huge export. And today there's still places in Oaxaca where they just grow prickly pear to generate more of this cochineal. So for the people in Baja California, it wasn't really something that they talked to me about, because they didn't, in prehistoric times, they didn't wear many clothes. They didn't have cloth. So the only things they were dyeing were maybe things like suede or leather that they might tan themselves.
So it's never been used as a food source, a protein source?
No, yeah.
Repeat the question.
Oh, so has it ever been used as a food source or a protein source? No, it hasn't. Not that I know of. Maybe it has, although there are other insects, and I mentioned that in my book about insects being used as food. The Mormon tea or Indian tea, miner's tea, which also is an antihistamine. It's kind of a stimulant, can be used in many different ways. And it's a very interesting plant. It grows, I've seen it growing on the coast all the way out into the hot, dry desert by Gila Bend, places like that. And so another plant that's got all kinds of medicinal uses. And just briefly to go through the process of the coast live oak, which is the main oak that people use down there. They call it bitter acorns. They have to be dried first, and then people get together and have a wonderful time sitting around talking and hear some of the Kumeyaay from Baja and Kumeyaay from California. We're having a fun time speaking in Kumeyaay, even though they didn't speak Spanish. The others, they couldn't communicate in Spanish or English, but in Kumeyaay they could communicate perfectly well. And so that was part of this process of grinding these acorns. And I'm sure you've all seen beautiful grinding stones and wondered who sat there and ground there and what were they doing. Well, eventually you get a meal, like a cornmeal looking thing, that you can then leach, like the leaching we saw with the holly leaf cherry. And that's added to hot water, and it turns into another mush that's an important food. And I wanted to mention that one of the few plants that doesn't grow here in Southern California that's endemic to Baja California is the Quercus peninsularis. and the peninsular oak, and that's what they call sweet acorns. You can just eat those right out of the shell. So for the most part, they're not very bitter. So we mentioned this earlier, the bladder pod Paratoma arborea, and this one, it wasn't even on my radar at all before I started doing this work, but they call it pshash, and they kept asking me, have you tried pshash? And I said, well, I don't even know what it is. So they took me out and they gathered just the tips of it, and then they boil it and throw that water off about 3 times. And then it makes a delicious, sort of like cooked cabbage or something like that. But it really stays with you. And Teodora told me this. She said, eat one of these in the morning and you won't need to eat anything else for the rest of the day. And it was true. You know, it keeps you going. It'd be great diet food.
Is that the flower?
Yes. Is that the flower? Yeah, it's the flower. It's the yellow flower. It's not, let me show you here. They're actually picking that yellow flower. The pod, they don't seem to have a use for, although I think Lowell Bean in his ethnobotany with Kumeyaay talks about people using the seeds. In Baja California, the seeds are only used in making necklaces. I have a few seed necklaces here that might have the seeds from these in there. Oh, and who was I talking about these plants with yesterday? Maybe Aaron. Anyway, I love bladder pod as a plant to use in the garden. Were we talking about that? Yeah, because it just blooms and blooms, you know, months at a time. And it's just such a cheerful plant. So yeah, use it that way too. Get it out there in the world. And I like to mention some of the things you may have around here. Of course, our Washingtonia foliifera, California fan palm. Did you know that those seed clusters are really sweet? And people would gather those and extract the kind of the juice from those and make something like molasses. So that's something else that people could use for food, but also the leaves were often used for thatching for houses, for traditional houses. And one of my consultants who was telling me about the process for making acorn mush said, oh, we would make a special spoon for stirring the acorn mush out of the leaf of that palm. And curiously, in each one of the native communities in Baja, there's one of these palms somewhere. And I wonder if maybe they were trading those things in because it was valuable to them. Or maybe they were bringing them to eat and throwing the seeds away. It can happen in a lot of different ways. Now, I'm crazy about the Mexican blue palm. So it's just such an amazing color. And this is endemic to Baja California, but you'll see them in landscapes all through Southern California, Arizona. They need no water. I mean, maybe the first year, get them established. After that, they'll just be fine on their own. You can make them grow a little faster with a little water. Don't overdo it. But they're such an easy plant, great like accent, or, you know, if you need some part of your garden where you don't want a huge tree, they'll eventually get maybe 40 feet tall. Anyway, oh, and another thing I found by living with them, because I have a whole oasis of them in my yard, is the blooms have a wonderful scent to them. So for about 3 weeks while they're blooming, they've got a beautiful scent. And also, Teodora came to my house and saw these and said, oh, we used to eat these. She said the men would leave from my community. They'd walk across the mountains. This was like about 25 miles through the mountains down to the other side. They gather on it, and there's hot springs there. And they weren't feeling well. She said they'd sit in the hot springs and then they'd feel better. And then they would come back to our village and give these to everyone. And then when they ran out, they'd go back and get some more. Imagine, you know, that kind of mobility, being that strong. There's a lot to be said for that way of life. So, of course, our beloved California poppies. If you go to Whole Foods again, you can pay a lot of money for some of these sleep formulas or relaxation formulas that have California poppy in them. I'm not telling you now to run out and gather the wild poppies, but grow your own, right? Have some in your garden, and they have opiates in them. So I think that has something to do with the relaxation part. So don't overdo it, folks. It's very mild, and it probably has to do with what else is, the other substances in there with those. I've also heard people would take a little piece and put it on a toothache, or if they had a sore part of their gums. But I've tried it. It tastes horrible. The sage, the chia, I'm sorry, also important food. Long before it became a superfood in your energy bars, it was food that people were using throughout the Southwest and California, Baja California. Here, making it into a drink, maybe toasting it a little, grinding it, making it into a drink. Again, the elderberry that you can, if you know how to gather it at the right time of year, you can use it as medicine, or also it's been used, the berries, as a drink. And elderberry wine, of course, could be made out of that. Many ways that elderberries are used. The white sage, and hopefully we all know by now that we're not supposed to go out and just pull up white sage. It's done. In fact, I was happy to see the copy of the, what is the name of the journal? The Flora magazine that has all kinds of articles about sage, and especially a lot of, well, I have an article in there too, and some opinions, thoughts from different Native folks from California. Did you know that this really just grows in Southern California and Northern Baja? It's not everywhere. We're really lucky. We live in the heartland of the white sage. Another one to grow in your gardens. I love having sage on hand for when I have a cold or sore throat or whatever. So here are the blue dicks, just an example of traditional management. I was interested to read in Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson, just fabulous book. If you're interested in all this stuff, run out and get it. I know a few people in here that have read it. It's a big tome like this. Anyway, she mentions that gatherers in California would take this, and when they gathered it, they would just gather the mama bulbs and leave the babies. And that means separating off the little babies. You see how they're connected? And they said that allows the babies to develop on their own. Otherwise, they're, how babies are, they'll just be there as long as they can until it's their time to grow up. And in the course of doing that, especially with a digging stick, you're making a little hole in the ground. They would often push the dirt back over, but now that it's going to be easier for the rain to go down there, and it's aerated. So, and this has also been documented, like with corn agriculture in the pueblos with an ads, and this way of doing horticulture really does help those plant populations thrive. And so, like, I was on Channel Islands and got to see some of the islands just covered with these. And guess what? Chumash people were living out there, lots of them. What were they living on? They left that legacy. Thank goodness for us. Yerba mansa that I was seeing here yesterday. I was happy to see that Ernesto is growing a lot of that. Important medicinal plant that's an antibiotic. It can be used externally, internally. This time of year, it makes us happy to see the beautiful berries on the toyon, also known as Christmas berries or Hollywood. And so I'm coming down to back to the end here, finally. With all this information as my internship for my master's thesis, I helped put together this museum in Tecate, the Tecate Community Museum. The first part of this is called the Cave of the Ancestors, and we did this in collaboration with the Kumeyaay people locally to have a place that tells the story of Kumeyaay people and the ways that they have lived in the different environments in that area for thousands of years. And so I'd highly recommend, if you ever get a chance, to try to go and visit that museum. Here, Norma Mesa at a workshop at the museum is showing some of the local tribal kids about how to use chia. And so I think I will end there. And I'm not sure if we have time for, okay, good. For questions and more, yes.
I think I recognize Mount Kuchima and possibly even Rancho La Puerta
Yes.
in photos. And I saw that, and I saw that they were a sponsor.
Yeah.
Have they been helpful with your access? And I think they give access to their lands to the original people there. not
Yeah.
just to repeat the question. I wrote
So
down
the
for
question, yes, okay, the question is about seeing Mount Kuchuma and maybe some photographs that were taken around Rancho La Puerta. So Rancho La Puerta, and how have they been helpful with the native peoples of that area? So Rancho La Puerta is a destination spa. I'm sure they have their own special way of language for what they call it, but I've been associated in different ways with them for over 20 years. So I go and give talks, and they've been very generous to let me stay there and give talks to the guests. And so that's been a fantastic experience over the years for me to be able to be there. And that also allowed me to do a lot of this work on the creating the museum, because that's in the same town. And from the very beginning, Sarah Olivia Seke, who is now the CEO, was very interested in learning about and learning from the Kumeyaay people in the area. And so she was eager for me to bring people from those communities in. We did like a workshop where some of the elders that you saw here were sharing the ways that they used a lot of the plants there for food and medicine. And then over the years, as I was giving talks about local ethnobotany, I asked Sarah Olivia to consider, why don't we have Kumeyaay people doing this? That would be great for the guests to have that experience, to be able to learn right from a Kumeyaay person. So as of last June, Norma, who's the woman on the cover of my book and that you've seen in several slides, has been going once a week and speaking to the guests. She speaks Kumeyaay and Spanish, so the guests speak English, so they have arranged to have one of their employees translate. Sarah Olivia also asked to have a traditional house and shade roof, ramada, put up, and so we did that too. And so in many ways, they're doing the right thing, which makes me really happy. They're finding ways to not just do the land acknowledgement, but actually have benefits for the local community coming out of what's happening. I'd like to see more and more things like that happening there and in other places. There are Kumeyaay people who are wonderful basket makers who could be invited to, I mean, it's an important part of their economy. So ways that they could be paid to teach and to sell their beautiful traditional arts. Those are like very direct benefits. It's a little harder to get people to be, setting up programs for within the communities. It's complicated, but those are some very specific ways that people can directly benefit the tribes. Any other questions? Yes.
So I assume you've tried many of the different presentations of eating the native plants. Which has been your favorite dish or plate or way of eating these native plants?
Okay, so the question is that I assume that you've tried many of these, to eat many of these native plants. Which has been your favorite? So this is an ongoing thing. It's like last year I would have had a different answer, but right now I'd say my favorite thing is the holly leaf cherry. It's just, it needs to be done right so that you survive the experience. But it's got a really good flavor. But I'm also coming to like more and more the acorn mush as a food. I love the flavor of the bladder pod and also the yucca flowers. I can sometimes take a little petal off of a yucca flower and eat it raw, and it can have a nice flavor too. But now another thing that I've been learning recently that just makes perfect sense is that a lot of the foods in the springtime were just leaves that you could gather and eat. And as a person who likes to be vegetarian or vegan, I thought, well, that's good. You know, I like it. We can eat leaves and survive off of that. So, so I've been trying to find out more and more about which plants, either native or, you know, non-native plants, I can eat that way. I'd say those are my favorites. And as far as medicines, I think the Areogonum is one that I like to use. I love the flavor of the white sage, just a little bit in a tea. And another thing I haven't even mentioned today is if I'm going hiking in a place where there's lemonade berry, I like to put some of those in my water. But something I didn't talk about with the roots on the upper right-hand corner is that that's an important woman's medicine. And so it's used when women are having problems in pregnancy. It helps everything come out. They make a tea out of it. There's a process to doing that. But I'm saying that because you also would not want to make a tea out of that if you're pregnant and you didn't want that to happen. And so and that's related to lemonade berry, all the rooses. So I'm not sure what the active ingredient is in that. So those are the ways you want to be really careful. I also like to just take lemonade berry and suck on one or two. Yeah. Okay, so yes.
Are all these items for sale?
Yes, and excuse me, I want to mention that, yeah, I have my book here. These are $30. And then just as an extra bonus, I brought some copies of the awesome John Redmond's book, Baja California Plant. Oops. Oh, there we go. Yes, there we go. John Redmond's Baja California Plant Field Guide. This is a must if you are planning to do any botanizing in Baja California. Also is published by Sunbelt Publications. And I wanted to mention that Sunbelt, which published my book, it has basically here the whole reason why I feel it's so important for us to keep doing this work we're doing about educating people about native plants and native peoples. This is says, in the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand. We will understand only what we are taught. And that's from Bomba Dianom or something like that, a Senegalese conservationist. And they put that in most of their publications. So, so good old Sunbelt, and they carry all kinds of other great titles about natural history. So these are available, and I can also sign your books if you brought your own or if you want to get one. And then there's traditional arts, basketry, and pottery. Steve will be in charge of helping you with that, of receiving the money and packing it up for you. I can take either cash or through Venmo or Zelle. You can pay in that way too if you're interested. So thank you again very much.
Reminds people of foraging ethics.
Just wanted to remind people about foraging ethics, that if you did want to try foraging, that you always have to have permission of the landowner. And if you're wanting to forage on various public lands, you have to have, written permits. Okay, so that's just a real reminder, and that we always, do this sustainably. Never, don't be an extraction creep. Okay, thank you. I think we're going to end our presentation now. I don't see how to exit, so I'm just going to exit. Okay, great. Thank you. And stop. Just want to do one more share.
This pottery is very good, really real nice price. It's like $20 per piece. It's really